So hello again. It's your host, Marissa True, and my co-host, Stu Elms, back for another episode of TezTalks Radio. Hey, Stu.
Hi, Marissa. It's been far too long. I'm glad to be back at it. How are things
It
in sunny Singapore?
Sunny. It's great. Weather's always good here. It has actually been a long while since our last conversation on TezTalks Radio, but today's topic promises to be a brilliant one. It's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Baker Cahill, who's a mixed media artist and founder of The Fourth Wall. And we also have Sarah Conley Odenkirk, who is the co-head of the Art Law and NFT department at Cowan, DeBaets, Abrahams, and Sheppard. Hi to the both of you guys.
Hello.
So before we dig into the meat of today's topic, I want to ask something that we always love asking here on TezTalks Radio, and that is about each of your respective journeys into this space. So Nancy, I'll start with you. How did NFTs and blockchain first become a part of your work, and how do you incorporate it now?
Thank you for asking. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm especially happy to be here with Sarah because she plays a crucial role in that personal journey. I want to say around 2017, I got really interested in blockchain and cryptocurrency, and Sarah and I started having conversations about art and how it could be applied to art. And at the time, it just was clear to me, given where my practice was at that moment, how that might work and how it might be integrated successfully. So it wasn't until really the kind of, I mean, this is such a hackneyed phrase at this point, but the whole sort of NFT craze or renaissance, whatever you want to call it, isn't really a renaissance, but that big sort of blast of a moment that we kind of rekindled those conversations and started thinking about how we could be really intentional and conceptual about it and collaborate. And so while my very first NFT project was with a wonderful artist created platform called Fearofile, which is just, everyone should look into that. It's amazing. It wasn't until Sarah and I conceived of the project that's called Contract Killers, which I hope we get to talk about today, that I really, got to get into the nitty gritty of what the contractual language of blockchain was really all about, how it might apply not just to the work, but to other sort of larger social issues. And so we can get into all of that. But that was really my initiation, I would say. So the seeds were sown very early, and then I really had the opportunity, thank goodness, because I was in a lot of great conversations, but especially with Sarah around a lot of the sort of legal and contractual issues to get into it. And that led to everything else.
So Sarah, a lot of credit from Nancy about helping her into this journey. So how did you actually find yourself bridging this space between art law and NFTs? And when we speak of art law, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, first of all, I have to say that my journey is all because of Nancy. So I guess we'll just feed off each other in this conversation. So let's see, art law. So when I started practicing, there weren't as many art lawyers as there are today. And art law was sort of one of those fields where you would say, I do art law, and people would look at you funny and say, what does that mean? Ultimately, what it means is really applying whatever law needs to be applied for artists and for creative, innovative projects. So it's a little bit of everything on the one hand, but my practice in general has been mostly focused on contract issues, intellectual property issues. I stay on the transactional side as much as possible. I prefer not to fight with people. I do love to make deals, and I would say the pinnacle of what I've done in the last, I won't even say how many years, has really been working with Nancy on these collaborative projects. And it just brings everything together that I've worked on for my entire career. So I started getting interested as well in about 2017, looking at it from the standpoint of working with a lot of artists who operate in the conceptual space, and really starting to see the potential for packaging conceptual projects in a way that wasn't possible prior to the advent of the NFT opportunity. So for several years, with a colleague who comes to Los Angeles from Italy every year, Massimo Stirpi, I would host these salon conversations at my home, and it was so much fun. And we would always try to pick some crazy subject that people hadn't talked about before. And one year, Massimo said to me, why don't we do blockchain? So we dove in and started researching all kinds of different projects that were art related, blockchain related. And we had, I think, the most spectacular group of people come that year. It was way full and jammed to the gills because everybody was starting to hear about it. Nobody knew what blockchain was. And so we were really just talking about blockchain. And it took a little bit from there, of course, to then evolve into actual projects. And then with the explosion last year, if we're going to start putting terms on what happened last year, the conversation with me and Nancy started because, well, it had started many years before, but the one that led to Contract Killers really was, about the frustration that we felt at the same time that there was this very exciting thing happening in a new space, or a space that was new for me, and somewhat new for Nancy, though she's much more involved and has been involved in the digital art world for much longer than I have. We had come through this period of social upheaval and all kinds of really important questions being asked about the structure of our communities and what was going on with COVID and social justice and the value for arts workers and all these really important issues that all of a sudden seemed to evaporate in the face of cash, right? Fast cash. So we got to talking about what does that mean and how can we respond? Me as a lawyer and Nancy as an artist who's been operating in this space, addressing issues of social justice and advocacy. And that's really how Contract Killers was born. And the rest, they say, is history.
Very cool.
So before we actually dig any deeper, can you both share what Contract Killers is, as you've both mentioned it? So it'd be really good to have a little insight into what the project is.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah just really foregrounded it so beautifully, but I think really what it was, we've been having all these conversations about accountability and asymmetrical accountability. And why is it that, there's all this sort of, why the onus is on individuals when, let's just take one example. Let's take climate change. When the lion's share of the damage and destruction being done to the environment is by corporations and governments. And so we also were kind of talking a lot about accountability in terms of remuneration for artists. That, what we saw happening, and certainly among our peers, were artists who were of an automated transaction, of automated remuneration. And of course, on top of that, the promise of royalties down the line. And so those sort of, and then of course, all the other issues that Sarah just mentioned, who is accountable? How do we kind of square ourselves with the fact that we belong to each other and yet we are in conflict all the time, and there is so much radical inequality and injustice. And so it sort of dovetailed beautifully, and I'll let her get into the particulars of how we sort of framed it, and we didn't solve it, but how we decided to present and engage the public around these questions. But how could we examine those questions of accountability using the contractual language of blockchain and this idea of a smart contract? And nobody talks about smart contracts better than Sarah, so I'm going to let her talk about that. But I sort of felt like, well, if we're going to talk about contracts and smart contracts, what about social contracts? What about broken social contracts? And the more we kind of researched these different platforms and blockchains and the ways that they either worked or didn't work together, and this whole promise of disintermediation and trustless trust, we started to think, well, this all sounds awesome, but is it really happening that way? Because when we looked at these ecosystems, and particularly the sort of largest ecosystem, and the highest sales and the lowest sales, we were thinking, this seems to be familiar. This doesn't seem as radical as it promises to be. And so that was the kind of fertile, loamy soil from which this project really grew and bloomed. And Sarah there's so much more to say about it. So Sarah, I the floor.
So from my standpoint, obviously I was incredibly honored to be able to collaborate with Nancy, given the rich history of her work and the important issues that she tackles. with all of our projects. And this one really, it came together so clearly and easily in some ways, because I think our conversation just automatically led to not only the imagery, but the messaging, and then also pulling together the written materials that went along with the visuals. So what I think struck me most initially when I started really digging in at this point was this term smart contracts. And several months before, somebody had asked me to give a presentation on smart contracts because they knew that I was sort of in the space and had been looking at blockchain. And I said, sure, I'll do a presentation on smart contracts. And as I did my research, I was like, wait a minute, there's not actually any contract here. This is a bunch of code, which is great, but it's not a contract. Contracts are nuanced. Contracts take into consideration the people who are involved. There are ways to change things and navigate different issues as a relationship builds and grows. You don't find any of that in current smart contracts. Nobody was paying attention to that last year. And so what we did was we wanted to create an actual contract, a smarter contract, that we attach to the visual aspects of the project. So, and this, unfortunately, very quickly, there are too many ideas to get out of my mouth at one time. They all get stuck. But the issue of how do you create a relationship between artist, creator, and audience? How do you make sure that there's a meeting of the minds there? How do you ensure that people understand what they're engaging in when they buy an NFT from an artist? I mean, sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Sometimes people are just purchasing something beautiful or fun that they see that they want to have in their wallet. But from the standpoint of looking at the role of fine artists and people who have taken their artistic practices very seriously, there is more than just the image that appears in an image on screen. It really is about the conceptual underpinnings and the rigorous engagement that those projects allow for. So how do we put that into NFTs when everybody's just going bonkers, just trying to collect as much content as they can with no thought as to what the underpinnings are? So I drafted a contract that we knew we weren't going to really be able to enforce because there's no meeting of the minds, there's no negotiations. And frankly, at that point, there wasn't even really any way to even notice people that there were terms associated with the NFT. Now things are starting to emerge and evolve. So there is more opportunity to do that kind of notification. We can get into that. But last year, what was it, in April that we were working on this?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Or even before, yeah, it must have been April. Anyway, there really wasn't a lot of conversation even happening around this. People were sort of a little bit flummoxed by this, presentation, this large presentation that we had both in the contracts and in the essays that went along with it. Nancy did a beautiful essay. Hessie McGraw, who's the director of the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, did an essay, and I did one as well. And we had the wonderful support of Misha Libman, who was at Snark Art. And the team of us together, put together all of this content that went along with the visuals and were attached to the metadata in a way that still, continues to travel with the piece. So, we can certainly get into some of the content of the contract, but one of the really important parts of this was making sure that people who are collecting the work understand that they're engaging with the artist, that there is a relationship there, and there's a responsibility as a collector to treat the work in the way that the artist wishes the work to be treated. And so there was some discussion around that, as well as some ways of trying to encourage compliance with the agreement rather than threatening termination or consequences if there's a breach, trying to include incentives. So Nancy created a separate NFT that if people complied with the requests in the contract, they were dropped an extra NFT. So we tried to be creative about thinking through different structures, new structures, and ways to engage with the audience. And I'm going to now let other people talk a little bit because I'm just blabbing on.
All right, it's my turn. Hi, Nancy and Sarah. I've been super looking forward to talking to you guys. Like I've been a big fan of digital art for a long time. To me, the suddenly having the opportunity to buy and own and collect and trade in digital art is extremely exciting. I've found the conversations that have emerged from the advent of the NFT and everything that's come along with that to be in equal parts sort of really exciting and extremely irritating. I'm curious, this one's more so for Nancy. What's it like sort of actively participating in and being sort of a leader in the early stages of an emerging medium like this, when the discourse around that medium is so filled with skepticism and dismissiveness?
Well, I thank you for characterizing me as a leader. I could think of 100 people or more who are more leaders than I am, but in this arena. However, I think it really is it's a matter of being really clear and focused about why you as an individual are in, and sort of treating all the other stuff kind of as noise. I actually found it exhausting, and I still do sometimes. Actually, I think a lot of the early discussions were sort of monolithic. They didn't tend to be terribly nuanced. They weren't concerned with larger sort of systemic questions or patterns that might be playing out in this. And while I would never characterize myself as, a techno-utopian. So I would probably characterize myself as one of those people that stood on the more critical end of the spectrum. On the other hand, I personally, and I think Sarah probably shares this opinion, for all that is still flawed, broken, or in any way sort of reproductive of what we already have, I do think that there is tremendous opportunity and potential to innovate and create better new systems, and not in with some sort of, forgive my French, but like libertarian wet dream, but more as a kind of genuinely collective, interdependent, and creatively really fruitful ecosystem. So I find a lot of conversations about NFTs incredibly annoying, and in many cases largely because I think they tend to either gloss over or ignore or remain sort of agnostic about impact and externalities, all of which, nothing exists in a vacuum, right? So I think, but probably what irritates me the most, is a lot of the sort of territorial conversations. Those tend to be the most, just kind of, they tend to be a real waste of time.
Sounds about right. This one's for Sarah. In looking at building a legal framework for NFT-based artwork, is it simply a matter of translating the frameworks that already exist in the traditional art world to fit a new medium, or is it requiring a reimagining of the framework altogether?
That is a very interesting question. I'm going to give you a very lawyerly answer, which is it's a little bit of both. It's a hybrid. Certainly there are things that work really well in the existing physical world that translate relatively well to the digital world. But, a lot of things about copyright law in particular are outdated anyway. Like, I would love to see some innovation around copyright in general, regardless of where it's being applied. This, I think, pushes things, the whole focus on NFTs pushes things to a place where it's very clear where a lot of the weaknesses lie in that intellectual property canon. But there's also the issue of Web3 kind of trying to bring a different ethos to creativity and to exchange. And so trying to balance that has really impacted the way that I think about contracts as well. Sometimes it has to do with the actual content and terms that we're looking at. Sometimes it has to do with simply the expository language that surrounds it so that it's put into a different context. It's not intended to, and understand too that my whole career has been spent telling artists and other creative people, don't think about contracts as litigation tools, think about them as communication tools instead. And I would say that this pushes it to a whole other level because it's even more about bringing compassion and empathy and compromise to a space where people want so much from it that they probably aren't going to be able to get ultimately, but we've got to figure out a way to navigate it and build something that at least serves as many desires as possible.
Well said.
I mean, before I launch into my next question, I want to just touch on a couple of things that have been said. In Nancy basically saying you're a more critical mind against this techno-utopian ideal, but then calling it a libertarian wet dream is something I think I have to quote and put on a t-shirt. I think that was fantastic.
I'll take one.
That'll be merchandise for all of us. And then Sarah, I think the way you put it is really interesting. So I think what we're looking at is basically this spurring of innovation, but from a traditional framework, and they have to adapt to new rules of play and a kind of a new dogma that's being presented by this Web3 world. And at the same time, this Web3/crypto world needs to conform to old rules to almost garner a bit more legitimacy. So in that, I mean, obviously you must be facing a slew of different challenges in trying to bridge that gap. But what are the primary legal challenges when it comes to things like using NFTs as proof of ownership and exchange in art? Because I think that's sort of the baseline of the NFT conversation, is this idea of digital ownership.
Yeah, well, Nancy and I were talking about this earlier today about how we're so tired of certain conversations. And on the one hand, they are old for us and we're tired of going over the same material again. But on the other hand, if we're going to have mass adoption of this technology, we're going to have that conversation a billion more times before people really are paying attention and there's a wider adoption of this space as being a legitimate marketplace, right? So I would say that, I spend a great deal of time educating people, and this is people within the space who are very knowledgeable in the crypto world, but don't necessarily understand intellectual property and don't understand that, we really can't have a libertarian space that functions well for people. If you want to continue to have a space that is hosting scams and pyramid schemes and, all kinds of cash grabs and rug pulls and everything else, sure, no rules, fine, we'll have no rules. But if you actually want to build something that has a legitimate purpose within the marketplace, supports artists, which to me is the most exciting part of this, and provides a sustainable tool for artists and other creators to use as a way of generating income and protecting rights, then we need to have rules that apply. So what those rules are, I cringe a little bit at the term old rules. It's like just any rules would be fine. They can be new rules. That's okay too. But we need to have some rules. And certainly we can learn from the past. We can learn from history. And by the way, intellectual property rules and rules of contracts still apply. Like, this is not a different planet that we're on. We're still on Earth. We are still in the United States. Those of us who, well, maybe Stu, you're not, but Canada's pretty close. So, we still have rules that exist. It's not as if this is a created space that has nothing at all that people have to adhere to. So explaining to people intellectual property rules is primary at the top of my list right now. But this was true before NFTs as well. Collectors will go into a gallery and purchase a painting, let's say, and take it home and assume that they own not just the painting, but everything having to do with the painting, all the intellectual property rights. They can cut it up into a million pieces and sell those pieces individually, or they can make t-shirts or postcards, or they can make their own version and sell that. That is not true. None of that is true. So in the existing framework, there's already a misconception as to what rights apply to creative works. Now bring it into the metaverse, into the NFT space, and you've got a whole new host of problems because it's much easier to copy things. It's much easier to share things. And so you've got this issue of making people understand, and it is hard, like even for lawyers, it's hard to separate the ownership of that JPEG that is associated with the NFT from all of the rights that go along with that property as a larger property. So that's a conversation that happens over and over again and is going to continue to happen. And even within the legal community, there are either misconceptions or disagreements or differences of opinion as to how you define what is the NFT, what is the asset, how do we look at that, and how do we break apart or treat those elements together as one composite asset. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but those are the areas that I think are really crucial. The other piece I'll just quickly say is the issue of the meeting of the minds. In order to have a contract, you have to have a meeting of the minds. It's very difficult to do that in a pseudonymous setting where you don't even know who you're dealing with, and there's no place where you have to actually agree. So you're stuck with terms and conditions or terms of service on the primary marketplace websites that say, if you use our services, if you are on our website and buy things here, you agree to our rules. Well, I mean, that's a little bit, it's a little loose. And so what we prefer to have is actually people engaging in the space in a way where they have agreed to particular terms and conditions. And in order to do that, the technology is going to have to evolve a little further to allow for specific and active acceptance of those terms that go along with the NFTs. Sorry,
No, I think that was very
to your question.
No, but it was really comprehensive, because I think the notion of intellectual property is probably the biggest hurdle that I've come across in terms of learning about the less enthusiastic side of the NFT conversation, in terms of how it's focused on building the legal infrastructure, or regulations, as it were, which we all know there's a big resistance to in a lot of these communities. And at the same time, I think a lot of people who engage with, the buying, selling, and trading of NFTs sort of have this blanket assumption that the NFT grants you ownership in entirety. And so that's where this intellectual property conversation comes back in, and saying, well, no, because if it's tied to, say a particular brand, especially as brands get more enthusiastic about entering this space, it raises more questions than it gives answers. But at the same time, I think that presents an immense opportunity to start rewriting these rules for a more digitally native future. So how do we create this meeting of the minds, as you put it? How do we spark this conversation between two sides who are almost at polar opposites of each other? One wants to implement rules and structure, and the other wants to have total freedom. Where do we even begin?
Well, I do think that vocabulary and semantics are really important, and I think that the term smart contract is a horrible term. Sorry. I realize that it's rather embedded in the space at this point, but it's very confusing. I mean, I had a client email me today saying, thanks for the draft terms of service. Are you going to get us a draft smart contract now? And it's like, well, no, that's what your developer does, because I am a lawyer, not a coder. And so there's still a misperception as to what that term smart contract means. I've been pushing for the term armature as a structure onto which other things can be built. I'm thinking, and I'm hopeful that sooner than later, what we're going to have is technology emerging that will in fact be able to merge the more comprehensive, nuanced contract with variables that can change over time into the NFT structure, so that we'll have a more embedded engagement that can be properly agreed to and accessed as purchases happen. You had mentioned earlier about about NFTs operating as proof of ownership or proof of authenticity, and these are things that have been said. But the fact of the matter is, anybody can mint anything, so there's no guarantee that that what's being minted is authentically that creator's. So we still have to deal with that problem the same way we do in the traditional fine art world. And same with provenance. Like, garbage in, garbage out continues to be an issue. And so we've got to make sure that we're putting into place systems that regulate how we view that information. I do think, and not to open up a whole other can of worms, but I do think it's really interesting that we're having these conversations at the same time that we're dealing with fake news issues and the lack of interest in actually pursuing facts and science in our lives. And I'll leave it at that for now.
I totally agree with you on the point about using the term smart contracts. I've always thought it was really weird. It's good to hear it articulated like that. Now, obviously, it's, the intellectual property rights and the nature of ownerships ownership of pieces of art is a pretty rich topic. But on a more basic level, owning a piece of art is not a totally new concept. We've had, the numbered prints have been a thing forever, right? Why do you think people, in spite of the fact that they've been around forever, why do you think that people struggle to get their heads around the idea of owning a piece of art in this medium? That one's more for Nancy, by the way.
So what you're asking, just to be clear, is what, like, why does it remain difficult for people to kind of to sort of collapse the definition of, like, what is an analog piece versus a digital piece, and how that plays out in terms of collecting and ownership? Is that what you're asking?
Essentially, yes.
I mean, I don't know how to answer that, honestly, because it's anathema to me as an artist who works in a hybrid way. To me, the digital work is every bit as quote unquote real as, the work you see behind me. So I think what's arguably more challenging for people is, I mean, yes, we hear that refrain a lot, sort of, it's just a JPEG, it's just a this, it's just a that. And I think that really, in essence, devalues all of the creative labor that goes into it. So we would have a whole separate conversation about the creative labor that goes into digital art, which I think is, there's this amazing American artist who did a whole thing on this recently, a performance piece. And I feel like if people understood just how much goes into creating these pieces, they might have a different type of appreciation for it as an art form. But when it comes to collecting, I think it's almost an ontological question. One of the things that I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for an unseen and unknown audience. But for me, collecting NFTs, I think a lot less about what they are, quote unquote, and how they live more in my consciousness. So I don't have any means of displaying them so far. I don't have any means of, I guess I could show them to people in my wallet, but knowing that they're there somehow occupies a space in my mind, and again, in my consciousness, where they have meaning, resonance, value, and where they kind of are aggregated as a collection. So I realize that's a very abstract answer to your question, but I think it's sort of, if I could encourage people to try to think abstractly and maybe get a little comfortable. And, when people talk about Web3 and quote unquote, the metaverse, I think that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And to me, it actually is, it's a mental space more than anything else. And so maybe it's just a matter of kind of taking that leap in consciousness around what is quote unquote real. And back to Sarah's point, of course, that's a contested idea and term from the jump. But maybe people are more comfortable in that space. It would appear so, in a belief space. But that's how I think about it.
One of you touched on it earlier and referred to sort of, if you're purchasing an NFT, if you're collecting these things, that's a form of a relationship with the person who made that thing, right?
Sarah, yeah.
I'm like you said, I can't put these things on my wall. I know I have them. The artist presumably knows that somebody has them. And that's the dynamic, is I like this artist. I like what they're doing. I want to support them. So therefore I'm going to provide some funds to that artist to continue doing their work in the form of purchasing an NFT, right? I guess what I'm wondering is, like, obviously, when we're talking about abstract things like you just did, I guess the question becomes, how do we bridge that gap for consumers? Like, obviously, the NFT and the digital art world is experiencing this massive period of growth, and like was said earlier, a lot of people don't necessarily understand what they're buying, what it represents, and what that relationship with the people who make those things is. Mm-hmm. So how do we, as people who are involved in this stuff, bridge that gap and communicate that information to the people who are just entering the arena?
You know, I'm just going to jump in and say that I think that one of the other interesting things about this space is the potential for developing patronage, true patronage. And so to go to exactly what you just said, Stu, about, you know, if I like an artist's work, this is a great way for me to support their work by buying their pieces, by contributing money to the projects that they're doing. And so in a sense, like, it doesn't even matter if I get anything in exchange. If I have had a satisfactory experience in enjoying their work, whether it's online or in an immersive environment, or in having a conversation with them, or participating in, you know, any sort of event that involves their work. So that idea of developing patronage and making it not connected to the things that I'm hanging on my wall, but instead the engagement that I have with other creators. I then develop a reputation, and I'm not saying that I have, because despite all the hours and hours I've put into this whole thing, I don't have that many NFTs in my wallet. But, you know, like, you develop a reputation for being somebody who supports the arts and who is a patron of the arts. And I think that this provides a really interesting space in which to develop that. And it's something that in the traditional art world, we always struggle with: how do we bring in new collectors? How do we encourage young people to engage with the art world? This provides that. This whole environment gives us exactly that space where we can bring young people, other people who are not necessarily art collectors, maybe they're gamers, maybe they're music fans, whatever. We can bring these people into this space through the tools that that the NFTs provide. So there's that end of it. The other part of it is community. You know, one of the big driving factors for all of this is community. People want to be part of a community. They want to be accepted in a community. They want to have a place where they feel that they belong. This provides that. So it's not so much about providing things to people. It is about providing space in which to belong and to exchange ideas and to interact with creators. It's also about being able to show your support through giving artists who are making this extraordinary work the means to actually survive. And that goes back to our conversation earlier about, you know, really trying to bring in that conversation around valuing the labor that goes into the creation of artwork in a slightly different way than we have in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point to touch upon, because going back to what Nancy was saying earlier, it is very much about the mindset that you apply to owning a digital asset. And I think if it comes down to the purest notion of ownership, that's when potentially, you know, if you're looking at it as an investment proposition, you want to see some returns. And so I guess the legal details of your ownership matter a lot more than if you are to purchase an NFT as a means of support. It's almost like, I don't know, like crowdfunding, or just, I mean, personally, the NFTs that I own are very much for that reason. I'm not adamant about making sure I know my ownership rights as much as I am about trying to display some level of support to the artist that I've purchased it from. But then to bring this back to the legal side of things, where these details can get a bit finicky, are there actually any cases that have been brought up, you know, within the last year or so, where this conflict of ownership, and that has, like, assuming that that is the mindset of the person who's purchased this NFT, has arisen, where we've seen a conflict between kind of old or traditional art law meets blockchain law, as it were?
Absolutely.
Loose term for law.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just a matter of cases, because there have been a couple of cases so far. You know, there's still, maybe you can count them on two hands at this point. We're going to see a whole lot more in the next year, because people are waking up to these issues and realizing how important it is to articulate those rights. What we can see that's almost more powerful than the cases that have come up are the strong community reactions to the conversation around rights. So take, for instance, the CryptoPunks conflict, where you have this very, very popular property, PFP project, that's been out in the space for a while. People have made tremendous amounts of money, very excited, you know, really rabid fans and excited about the space. And then you've got CryptoPunks coming along and riffing on that, really appropriating it and flipping it and, you know, undermining a lot of what the CryptoPunks had built. So that raises the question of what do you actually get when you buy one of the CryptoPunks? And the CryptoPunks very clearly had retained their, well, I think they did change their terms, but they were very clear about retaining the rights, retaining the intellectual property rights, which the community responded very poorly to. And they wanted more of the Bored Ape Yacht Club environment where you buy your PFP and you get to do pretty much anything you want with it as long as you don't use the trademark or logo of the company itself, you can use your ape on anything you want. These are really interesting questions, and it is important to pay attention to the environment into which you're selling, because frankly, the other thing I will say is that creating NFTs is not magic, and you can't just create an NFT and become a millionaire. You have to market it to somebody. There has to be an audience willing to buy it. So if you want the audience to buy it, you have to think about what it is they want. Why do people want to be able to do whatever they want with it? Frankly, from the standpoint of traditional trademark law, you're creating a mess, right? If you've got 10,000 Bored Apes out there on all different products of all different quality and from anywhere, like, you have no way of knowing whether that Bored Ape product is something good or bad, poisonous or healthy, or there's just no way of knowing. Whereas there is some reliability, and that's the reason we have trademark law in the first place and protection for that, is that if you go to a McDonald's or a Starbucks or any number of chain restaurants, you're going to get the same thing wherever you go in the world. So we do have this undermining of that traditional association, which isn't necessarily terrible. It's just that we have to rethink about, what do we want? Why did those things emerge in the first place? Do we need consumer protection? And so there are really crucial questions that need to be answered that will unfortunately be, I think, in large part answered in litigations. And so we're going to see the courts weighing in on what a lot of these property rights mean. And unfortunately, just like in art law, where we don't have very many judges who are educated about art history and understanding the nuances of the art world, you can be very well assured that there are very few judges that really understand the crypto world and NFTs and what all that means. So we're talking about people with not that much experience in this world weighing in on what the rules should be. So it's going to be an interesting time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those learning by doing sorts of scenarios. So the more cases that are brought up, the more lessons we're going to learn from it. And that might be the thing that eventually shapes this, new realm of written rules. But Nancy, something you mentioned earlier that I want to go back to is this idea of territorialism between sort of crypto native artists and then digital artists that are entering into this space. And the fact that digital artists are used to, or traditional digital artists, by that I mean non-crypto natives, are familiar with the older rules of play or the offline rules of play versus this new realm of, I don't want to, because it's not lawless, but at the same time, it's unregulated in this crypto space. So how do the rules of play look different to you? And then how are you navigating both? Because you're kind of straddling both spaces.
That's a great question. Before I answer it, I just want to tack one thing on to what Sarah said, which is about law, and that is a law that's something that I learned from actually a lawyer who I've dealt with about geolocated augmented reality. And one of the things she said was, bad law is reactive, and that you always want to lay the sort of discursive foundation before you end up in a place where you're just in a position of having to scramble to make law, and the circumstances are basically not ideal to do that. And it's almost always bad law. And I think one of the things that Sarah and I tried to do both with the Contract Killers Project and then more recently with Mushroom Cloud is to do that foregrounding and to do that work in advance, to kind of anticipate what might go wrong and to anticipate what these conversations might be, and to build them into either the new armature or proposed armature, or embed them in the metadata or in the blueprints that Sarah has drafted. So I just wanted to say that just as a kind of postscript to what she said. And to answer your question, I think, there are always going to be kind of, I would say, tussles, which is probably a gentle way of saying it, around aesthetics. I think that everyone has opinions, and everyone comes at this from a different place. And I think that that one of the things that has been exhilarating to a lot of artists who didn't have markets, who didn't have an audience per se, and who might not have been accepted in the traditional art world, is that it immediately opened up new opportunities, new communities, new ecosystems for them, not just to share their work, but to sell it and to make a living. And I would never want to deny anybody that opportunity any more than I would want to deny it to myself. I think, on a personal level, I guess I wish I saw more work. I mean, the NFT projects that really excite me are the ones that I think are going to have lasting impact and really be part of a larger, not just a larger artistic discourse, but kind of an art historical discourse, are those that both engage the technologies in really creative and innovative ways, those that are about more than just the technology. I'm really less concerned about the aesthetics and more about the conceptual undergirdings. And unfortunately, I do think those are, statistically in much shorter supply. I also don't think they sell as well. And so there's these sort of unfortunate truth and reality that, a lot of markets, and we talked about this before, and I think this really bears repeating that that while it has created a lot of opportunities and a lot of, I really never want to use the word democratizing, because I don't think it's democratizing at all, really. Actually, I think when you look at the radical differences and inequities, but in terms of gender and sales, we're not, it's not democratized any more than what we're living in here in the United States is a democracy. I'm sorry, not to get I just went to 11 there. We're really feeling it here right now, as Sarah alluded to earlier. Listen, I think one thing I wanted to say earlier too about decentralization is that decentralization works in a lot of natural systems. Look at mycelium. It's a beautiful thing, but just sort of pure decentralization all of these are nuanced concepts, right? It's not always a good thing. We do need some kind of governing. We need governance. And so I think that you can't, lawless isn't you're not wrong when you use that word. Some could argue that that's what DeFi is, but I think that with just pure decentralization, I don't know, that's a different type of a lack of accountability. So that's a whole other conversation that I find so interesting. But in terms of that sort of the territorial stuff, I don't know. I think it misses, I think when I see some of the squabbling on Twitter, I kind of feel wow, we're kind of missing the forest for the trees here. I think we really need to talk about larger systemic issues, talk about where there's innovation happening, where there isn't, what is merely regurgitating or reproducing what existed before, and how can we move beyond that, and really get past, honestly, just a lot of language, a lot of pretty language that's really easily adopted, and actually get into rolling up our sleeves and doing it.
I think
we're presented with this technology being around and these tools being available to us. We're presented with an opportunity to make change happen and to upend some of the things that have historically caused massive problems for people all over the world, right? So there's a lot of potential there for this to get us to a better place than where we started. Obviously, this is an incredibly rich topic. We have way more questions that we were planning to ask you, but I am aware that we're sort of coming to the end of our time here. So the sort of last thing that I wanted to ask was, Nancy, from a digital artist perspective, are there specific concerns that you have attached to making this kind of art and distributing it in this way that are new, that have emerged since the emergence of the NFT?
I would say that my hope, it's less of a concern and more of a hope. One of the things I'm really looking forward to is a true interoperability. One of the things that Sarah and I talk a lot about is where are the opportunities, where are the sort of cracks in the concrete. And so how can we kind of smooth those out, shore them up? And this is a terrible metaphor, forgive me, it's because it's been a long day. But I kind of feel like, how can we, like, maybe interoperability is part of building in protections, so that, like, when you sell an NFT as a digital artist, you don't have to worry that it's going to be taken off chain. You don't have to worry that you're not going to see those secondary market returns, which is a true concern. I mean, I think that that's part of the promise of this technology, which is really, really important, and doesn't actually work or exist in the, outside of the blockchain arena. So that's one thing I guess I would say I'm really looking forward to. And also, just as these blockchains innovate, and as we get closer to ETH2 and all these other things, I think it's just going to open up, and and sort of watching as how DAOs evolve. I think that there's a lot of really rich content to come, and I think that also building in remuneration, making these armatures much more complex, so that we can remunerate not just the digital artists but other collaborators. That seems like a really fertile territory to look forward to as well.
Any final questions, Stu, before
No, that was, as I said, I was going to finish with that.
Okay, nice. I mean, Nancy, as you were saying before, I think the thing to be excited about is very much this, and Stu touched upon it as well, this opportunity to change social dynamics in a digital sense, and having to consciously steer away from replicating what's not currently working in the world, whether it relates to things like American democracy, as you delicately touched upon, or other systems of social inequality, and making sure that this is for the better, and this isn't about this unregulated cash grab, as I'm sure some people are using this this new technology for. As Stu said, I think we could genuinely go on down this rabbit hole for hours and hours, but unfortunately we do have to wrap up this conversation, so we'll save it all for another time.
Can I just
and
say
I really
one last thing?
Please.
Absolutely.
I
Yes,
just want to
please.
say one last thing, which is tagging onto what Nancy just said. I think it's really important that people are not complacent. We've got big companies coming into the space very quickly. And as that happens, we're more likely to see the existing structures replicated within the Web3 space. And, it's really, again, a mirror of our existing world, our real life world. I don't want to say real life, it's all real life, but, our physical world, that complacency has led us to no place good. We have to be really, really conscious about where we're taking this, what we're building, and how we're doing it, and who we're interacting with. So I just want to put in a plug there for not being complacent as we move forward.
I completely agree. I feel like, the last time we sort of experienced this sense of hope that a technology was going to give us more freedom and break down some of the old systems that weren't working was when I'm old enough to remember when the internet first appeared, right? And all the promise that it held, and all the expectations that people had. And if you look where it is now, it's kind of sad. And I agree with you. I mean, complacency is what got us there, right?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a matter of understanding that the technology isn't going to save us. It's how we use it and how we design it going forward that's actually going to be the case. And I think that was so aptly put by the both of you throughout this conversation. And I'm also, frankly, more hopeful than I am skeptical, given that we are having these conversations and that we actually have women like you who are actively working on it. So on behalf of society, thank you. The final detail before we go is for those who have tuned in and would like to reach out to you or find out more about the work that both of you do, where can they find you? Sarah, why don't you go first? Where can people find more information about your work?
People can find more information. I'm not going to give you all the different links, but certainly my firm's website, which is cdas.com, and my email address, which is sodenkirk@cdas.com. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Perfect. And Nancy?
You can find me, you can reach me through my website, which is nancybakercahill.com. I'm also on Instagram as @NancyBakerCahill, and I also am on Instagram as @FourthWallApp, but mostly nancybakercahill.com. That's probably the fastest way.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. I frankly have a lot more questions now based on all of your answers, but I will message you privately about those.
Yes, thank you so much.
More.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.